Hello and welcome to the HealthTech Hour on UK Health Radio, the world's #1 talk health radio. My name is Steve Roest, and each week we bring you the best news, views and interviews from the founders, CEOs and clinicians who are changing the face of healthcare in the UK and beyond. I'm a CEO and founder of a health tech business myself, and I'm hugely passionate about the people and companies who are changing the world. Before we start, I want to say it's good to be back. We took a few weeks off just to recharge the batteries, refresh. Now we're back. We run into Christmas and the New Year, which will take into account our actual birthday on the show, our first birthday on the show. Please make sure you follow the show on the socials, which is at HealthTech Hour, and also follow the station at UK Health Radio. We have a hugely exciting schedule in the run up to Christmas. So make sure you follow to stay on top of everything that's coming up. So this week, we have one of the new pioneers in digital health on the show, Dafydd Loughran, who is the CEO and founder of Concentric Health. Now, Concentric Health are, like my company, PocDoc, an alumni of the NHS Digital Accelerator. Huge shout out to the guys on the Digital Accelerator. It's their 5th birthday this year, 5 years of being the leading route into the NHS for digital innovators and digital health companies. So yeah, well done to Jenny, Ruth, and the whole team over there. Concentric Health are another example of why I love doing the show. It's a really great, elegant solution to an endemic problem across healthcare systems, not just in the UK, but across the world, that is critically important, but on the face of it, probably or possibly might get overlooked by patients as to how much a difference or how important it is to get this particular thing right and the risks of getting it wrong. So Concentric Health are market leaders in what they call digital consent. So no more paper consent forms. Concentric is being used across the NHS, across a number of trusts. And is playing a key role in clearing the huge surgical backlog that we all know is there, thanks to COVID. Well, it was there before COVID, but COVID made it a lot worse. Dafydd himself is surgically trained, has worked in digital health across in a number of ways across the last 6 years, and is a hugely mission-driven founder, and that is what we like to have on the show. So Daf, how are you?
Very well, thank you so much. Thanks for such a lovely intro, thanks.
Well, you know, we try. People are going to take their time to come on the show. We try and, and every word I said was true. So all good. What's currently, I like to ask everyone, what's the current mood in the camp like at Concentric? Because, if it's anything like at our place, the last 12 to 18 months has just been non-stop. But what's the mood in the camp like at Concentric?
Yeah, so I think we'll kind of touch a bit in a moment in terms of all the stuff that's happening around elective care, but yeah, that's definitely a few funding rounds have come out recently from NHSX and stuff. So quite a few big announcements having just been made and some more about to come out. So I think we're gearing up for a busy winter.
Yeah, I think everyone's gearing up for a busy winter.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Cool. So as regular listeners know, and thank you very much to all the regular listeners to the show. Thank you very much for getting in touch and telling us what you love, what you don't like. That's all very well taken. The show is in 3 parts. So the first part is an origins part around how Daf came to be doing all the phenomenal world-changing stuff that he and Concentric are doing. The middle bit's all around what Concentric are doing right now, and then the final bit, if we get to it, is more around the future. So let's kick off. So we've had a number of clinicians turned CEO founders on the show. I think it gives a really unique insight, actually, particularly within digital health, or if you're running a digital health business, about moving from a surgical or clinical role or pathway into starting your own company. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely echo that. So, my story was that I started playing around in this kind of consent and shared decision-making space. So shared decision-making being the kind of concept of patient and clinician together being able to make the best decisions. So, clinician as the expert in the medicine and the patient being the expert in themselves and what matters to them and their preferences and priorities. But so I kind of started playing around with some stuff way back in 2012, 2013 as a baby junior doctor, and I essentially went to a hospital where first day I was told, right, you're the new F2, the second year doctor.
Is that what your job on this? A code is an F2. That's the official code.
Yeah, so second year doctor, and I was told on the first day, right, one of your jobs on this firm, as it were, is to consent all the patients, so make sure they've all signed their piece of paper before we operate. And I kind of, well, great, okay, I don't really know much about orthopedics, but I'll give that a go. And I very, very quickly felt very uncomfortable having these conversations about, operations that I, maybe had vaguely heard of.
Okay.
But my job as a junior doctor was to get a signature on a consent form. So basically, my kind of journey into this was trying to solve that little bit of problem for my own sake as a clinician. So I started building some resources of information that I'd use, and other junior doctors around me would be like, before you go and have that conversation with the patient, Dav, what are you doing on your phone? Like, we don't usually have our phones out on the ward. And I was like, so I've got this, thing of information that I kind of remind myself and use, and then I go and try and have a valuable conversation with the patient. And that, seemed to kind of strike a chord with people. And some people started using it, and suddenly it was kind of, in the lightest touch, inverted commas ever, a kind of startup, because at that point in time, when you talk about, back in 2013, 2014, that kind of clinical entrepreneur thing was so small. It was so early that basically if anyone was doing anything, everyone knew what you were doing. And so, I had that first few experiences of, going and pitching an idea, and, the stuff that you just, don't do in med school and clinical training and this kind of stuff. And this first glimpse of, an opportunity to be creative and think about problems and try and solve them, off your own bat. So this was kind of, really early little glimpses of that kind of stuff, but it was enough that in 2015, I decided, well, I'm just curious about some of the stuff off the kind of usual training treadmills. If you think about how, surgeons are trained, or, other medical specialties as well, you go through med school, and then, you're into, 5 to 10 years of training before you get to that kind of consultant grade. And that's often described as a kind of training treadmill. It's very, very, prescribed. There's, as you say, there's, a code for each year, and there's exactly specific things you have to do in each year. And it's pretty difficult to kind of feel creative in that kind of thing. So I was like, well, I'll explore something.
Well, did when you came up with this, or when you were doing this, like, did people think you were kind of crazy? Were they like, why don't you just follow the normal protocol? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Or
So
were they kind of like open to it and being like, oh, wow, that's cool, I wish I thought of that?
So I think when there was kind of, other junior doctors who'd see, me, for example, using that kind of really early aid memoir app, I think that was kind of, people were curious and interested. But then, so 2015, 2016, I made the decision to kind of step out of, usual surgical training. And I'd been the kind of guy who'd done his surgical exams like stupidly early, and was like, going to be a consultant as,
fast track. You were fast track.
As absolutely as quickly as I could be and stuff. And so, and then suddenly I was saying, well, I want to step off this treadmill and do something different. And I had some, really tough conversations at that point with, people who were my kind of education supervisors, or, people who were meant to be kind of mentoring me along that journey. And absolutely, there's no, more than once there was the, you're throwing it all away type of comments made, and, well, you won't be able to come back and all this kind of stuff. And so that was definitely pretty challenging.
Well, let's just take it back a step. So at what point, when, in your life, because I know that obviously, like you said, you decided to go down a medical route. Was that something that you decided pretty early on, because or was that something you fell into, or like when did you realize that healthcare in some way, shape, or form was your path?
Yeah. I think the last time I was asked that was a med school interview.
Well, nothing if not up to date. Nothing if not finger on the pulse here on the health.
Yeah. So I used to play decent level tennis. So I played, some, national and some European tour kind of junior tennis stuff. Unfortunately, you can't quite tell on the radio how tall I am, but I'm 5'10", but not 6'2". Okay. And as a 14, 15-year-old, I was significantly shorter than that. And so so really it was, I suppose I had in those kind of early teenage years, thought I would do kind of sports stuff, and then I think it was a bit of a kind of transition from, I was thinking, well, if I'm not going to be a professional sports person, then, do I do something in terms of, sports nutrition or sport? And I kind of ended up falling into that kind of, health stuff. And I went to a school where quite a few people, state school back in West Wales, but one that has kind of traditionally churned out quite a few medics.
Okay.
There's a kind of busload of us who go to Cardiff Uni from West Wales, from the school, as it were.
It's like a very well-trod pathway, right?
Yeah. So
Okay.
that was kind of, I think, there are other stories you give in terms of, being around when your grandmother fell down the stairs when you're 6 and stuff. But I think that's probably a more truthful story of falling into the path.
And how did you? Because you ended up in urology, is that correct?
Yeah.
And how did you end up? Because it's not necessarily, an obvious place to end up. Was it a selection, or was there a motivation for that?
Yeah, so I think probably a very shared story with so many clinicians where, so my first surgical job as a junior doctor my first job in hospital as a junior doctor was a surgical job, and it happened to be a really great one, and had one particular registrar who was just so supportive and was just incredible. And so that started the path. And I think so many clinicians might have some ideas about what they want to do in med school, but really it's that first really good job that really says, actually, that's what I'm going to do.
Oh, that's cool. I've never actually known that. I didn't know that was what happened. That's interesting.
Yeah, first great mentor is I think the driving factor to what most people do in medicine. Okay.
And when you decided to how would you refer to it? More of an executive pathway as opposed to a clinical pathway when you moved out of traditional clinical work? And how would you describe that change?
Yeah, so I think it was more mission creep for me, really. So I kind of, so I was in that state where I knew that I wanted to explore something slightly different to that pathway. There was an opportunity to kind of do 12 months as a kind of a clinical leadership year, which is something that is available within training pathways. I was again kind of super lucky to be given lots and lots of flexibility in that year to say, I had a coffee with education supervisor John Bolton on that kind of first day in that fellowship, where he basically said, we kind of had a project teed up for your year, but I'm kind of interested in where your brain takes some flexibility and space, this kind of thing. And so I had a really just a year where I explored loads of stuff. I kind of ended up doing things in digital health, sat in a few startups, spent some time in London doing, seeing how startups worked, seeing how different, quality improvement setups worked in different places. Mm-hmm. And off the back of that, got hired by Babylon Health, who I'm sure a number of listeners will know of Babylon.
Yeah, so kind of a big digital health company.
Yeah. So I went to Babylon, reasonably early in Babylon's journey. It was 80 people or so. Was there for 18 months, 2 years, and by the time I left, it was 800 people. So,
wow, that's crazy.
So saw an amazing journey for that company, and clearly Babylon is controversial, but has also pushed boundaries in so many ways. But just seeing a company go from a startup to an organization that had to work out so many things was fascinating to see, and I think put me in a position where when an opportunity came via some Innovate UK, so kind of UK gov funding in 2018, 2019, to go and take what had been this kind of passion project, side project, as I said, from 2013, 2014 around consent and shared decision making, and kind of make it a real thing in a business. I think those 2 years at Babylon made that so much more possible to execute that properly than if I just suddenly stepped out of medicine to do that.
Well, I want to come back a little bit to like, because you obviously now are a startup, well, you know, are founder of a startup. So I want to kind of come back around to like some of the learnings and some of the impressions that you've got, the differences and some of the things that you've learned having done that journey. Because like I said, I think that journey from clinician to founder of a startup is hugely valuable to kind of explore. But just for our listeners, I think what would be really helpful, and also for me, but what are the basic challenges that exist around patient consent, shared consent? Just give us the landscape about what the issues are, because I'm sure that a large number of people listening will have been in a hospital and will have had to have signed a form and may have thought about it, may have not thought about it, you know, but just give us the spread, you know.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, one of the key challenges here is that, you know, whereas in most, you know, walks of life by now, you know, we've become kind of more consumer driven. We're kind of, you know, we're aware of the decisions that we make in lots of different spaces in our lives. But healthcare in many ways has been the kind of last bastion of autonomy of decisions. It's, you know, you go into hospital and it feels like it's really complicated and difficult to engage with, and lots of the systems that don't particularly make it that easy for you to engage with. And so many of us kind of take off our own hats and say, okay, you know, I don't understand this stuff. So doc, you know, what should I do? And it's been this very, you know, paternalistic meaning, medic as making the decision for the patient rather than the other way around. And we know there's, you know, huge challenges in terms of that. There's lots of, you know, some of the numbers from places like, you know, think tanks like the King's Fund mean that probably about 20% of operations are happening when actually, if the patient was, you know, really kind of understood the different options and how different things would impact them in the, you know, short, medium, long term, they would make different decisions, often, you know, more conservative decisions. There's some really kind of stark examples of that. So, you know, some pathways where, depending on who you see first, you know, there's some trusts where if you've got certain musculoskeletal pain, you go to a physio first, or if you go to a surgeon first, actually the outcomes in terms of what treatment that person has is massively different depending on
the same,
who they see
for in theory, the same set of symptoms, the same problems.
Exactly.
And so going back to that 20% figure, so what you just to understand, because we like metrics on the show. What you said was that there's some evidence and some papers, some documentary evidence that suggests or shows that 20% of operations may not necessarily have happened if the person had been given more information around the consent or otherwise of that particular pathway. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And have that, so that's absolutely right. And for some procedures, it's much higher than that.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. So it says, good example kind of at the extreme of that is that in kind of prostate operations for older guys. So clinician, so there's some really interesting data in terms of how clinicians kind of perceive things that are important to men in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So traditionally, if you having prostate problems in your 60s, a clinician would have a detailed conversation with you around, you know, the risk of erectile dysfunction if you have, you know, an operation in your prostate and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
This kind of silent assumption that you probably didn't really need to have that conversation with someone in their maybe late 70s and early 80s. But actually, if you ask the patients, they're like, do you know what, my sex life's still really important to me. And so
so it was sort of like a given that like 70 or 80-year-olds wouldn't really worry about erectile dysfunction, and therefore would be more inclined. That is almost like a default. So is it a bit like the default changed? The doctors or the clinicians changed the default based on age group without consulting the people in the age group?
Yeah, and sometimes that's to do with age groups, sometimes that's to do with different characteristics. But basically, that, you know, I think we have seen time and time again in the evidence that, you know, clinicians, and I'm a clinician myself, and, you know, there's lots of things that clinicians do very well, but one of the things that clinicians struggle with, and it's of no surprise given that you know someone for maybe 5 minutes before you know starting to make these decisions for them, is that there is a discord between what a clinician thinks is important to a patient compared to what that patient prioritizes for themselves. And we see that time and time again. And, you know, sometimes that's because of assumptions about age, sometimes that's assumptions about different characteristics. But, you know, what we've seen, you know, in the evidence over the last, you know, 20 years or so, is that if you can bring those two parties together, this kind of concept of shared decision making, to say, clinician, you understand the medicine, you understand the options, you understand, you know, the differences, but you need that patient to give it that context for that patient. So what are the important things to that patient? What are the things that, you know, worrying them? What are their like priorities for what, you know, they need to be doing in 30 days, 5 years, 10 years, whatever that is. And if you can bring those two together, so thinking of the clinician as a guide rather than a decision maker, so it's, you know, some people call this supported decision making rather than shared decision making, then actually that decision is significantly better. And yes, sometimes that's more conservative, but sometimes it goes the other way as well. It's, you know, that you have an operation, whereas otherwise the clinician might think you didn't need it.
And do you think, and this might be wrong, so feel free to tell me that I'm completely bonkers, but was there kind of a fear before you started Concentric, the desire or sort of, I guess, inclination of clinicians to sort of force is too hard, but more proactively guide or sort of take decision-making power away from patients? Was that sort of was that being done like proactively, or was it more subconsciously? And was it around, well, we just know better than they do, ergo, you know, 1 + 1 = 2, or was it like a fear of the patient making the wrong decision? You know, so like in an instance where a patient, where really you know, 9 out of 10 patients should choose option A, you know, is there a fear that like by giving them too many options, they might just choose like clinically the wrong option? Or is there never a clinically wrong option? I don't know.
Yeah, so it's definitely multifactorial, right? But I think you touch on some important things there in terms of, you know, shared risk, you know, the feeling of doing something. You know, I think, you know, oncology and chemotherapy treatment and this kind of stuff is a good example where there is a strong, you know, desire or feel to do something, to offer something if you can. So sometimes to make the decision not to do something, you know, requires some of that kind of shared risk and, you know, shared acceptance of that kind of decision between clinician and patient. And then, you know, I think in terms of, you know, there's challenges around the system. So, you know, in terms of having these, like, you know, great shared conversations with patients, I think, you know, we all know that, and, you know, that makes clear sense. Like, it doesn't need anyone to tell you that you should be having great conversations with patients about, you know, what matters to them. That sounds obvious.
I'm not sure anyone's going to do the old counter argument to that, right?
Exactly, but you know, there are definitely challenges in the system that make that, you know, hard or easy to kind of drop. You know, in the pressures of, if you think about, you know, one of the difficulties in terms of the consent process, you know, historically has been that so many of these conversations have happened, you know, on the day of surgery. Patients already, you know, in their gown, got their bottom out, as these horrendous surgical gowns are. You know, they're about to be wheeled into theatre. They've got their surgical, you know, theatre block. You know, they're teed in for that 90 minutes in surgery, as it were. And a clinician is having this really rushed conversation. As I said, you know, sometimes that's a consultant, but sometimes it's someone much more junior and potentially more junior than they should be having that conversation.
As in your example,
as in my example, where, you know, you have a surgical operating list starting at 8 a.m. You've rocked up to the hospital at 7:30, conscientiously coming in half an hour early, but you've got to cram in, you know, all the conversations for your list that day, which might be, you know, 7 or 8 patients. And, you know, there's an expectation for you to be in theatre, you know, ready for the, you know, briefing conversation in theatre at 8. And so it becomes transactional, right? So the transaction that you need is a signature on a consent form. You know that what you should be doing is having a really good, valuable conversation, but somewhere in that, you know, pull push, there's, you know, you lose that ability.
On that is a very good way to segue into how Concentric Health solves the problem. So talk to us about what Concentric does and how it addresses these issues.
Yeah, so Concentric is a digital consent and shared decision making application, which essentially tries to make it really easy to empower patients with personalized information, evidence-based information, aid that understanding, and we'll kind of touch upon where in the pathway that can happen and the opportunities for that. And at the end of the day, to support that shift towards informed shared decisions, patients owning those decisions for themselves. And lots of this is about making that information really accessible. That it's not just a quick conversation with a clinician where you're trying to take it all in, but the reality is that you remember nothing more than a few percent of it, and that you can go back to it, that it's personalized, that and be able to engage with this information and make some decisions, and not just in those 5-minute consultation, but in the 99.99% of the time that isn't that 5-minute consultation, and support that pathway.
I think it's a fantastic idea, fantastic mission. So just again, try and help people understand, because I think conceptually makes total sense, but actually, like, how what's the user journey like for a patient? And then I guess for more on the clinical side would be super interesting. So like, you can start with the patient, just walk us through how it completely revolutionizes the way a patient interacts with a potential operation and that consent process.
Yeah, so the first thing to say is, and I think one of the things that people sometimes misunderstand is that this, Concentric as a digital consent application isn't taking the clinician out of that consent process. So, for example, one of the things that a clinician has to do is kind of prepare that information for the patient. So the start of any consent episode, if you want to call it that, is that a clinician prepares the information for that patient. Now, clearly that's supported with evidence-based templates and the kind of information that we provide, but a clinician uses what they know about that patient or previous conversations to tweak it, to personalize it, to kind of say, well, actually, in you're diabetic and this and that, and so your risk of a wound infection is higher, or that kind of stuff. And then at that point, that is shared with a patient in one of a number of ways. So we'll see some clinicians say, okay, you're coming in for a kind of consent conversation with me in clinic, on Thursday, so I'm going to send you some information out, a couple of days before, so that you can have a look at it, kind of understand it, think about your questions, make your notes about it. And then, the aim is then to say, let's have a conversation about this, rather than me dictating a load of information to you. So, if that consultation between clinician and patient can be a dialogue about what they've read, or about that information. So it can be a question and answer, posing, thinking about things, rather than just trying to take all of that information in that you're being presented, then I think that's so much more valuable.
Agreed.
Frankly, it's so much better for the patient, but it's also so much more interesting for the clinician to be having that proper, valuable conversation, rather than just throwing stuff away.
Okay.
And so sometimes that's at the moment, obviously we've seen lots of that happening alongside virtual consultations, that kind of stuff. And then one of the challenges for us is that we still see lots of this happening on the day of surgery. So there's a big attempt to move these conversations from.
And is that just because that's always the way it's been done? That's just what happens?
Yeah, and it's often surprising to even others in the hospital, the fact that the majority of these consent conversations have happened on the day of surgery. Now, clearly there may have been some,
there'll be some discussion before.
There'll have been some discussion beforehand, but it often won't have gone into the kind of proper detail. There'll be a decision to list for surgery, but it's been done reasonably light touch at the end of a consultation, as it were, rather than going into the detail about actually what this really might mean for you in the short, medium, and long term, and really what the other kind of alternatives are, and checking that this is definitely the right thing. And so that historically has been the kind of majority use case, and we're trying to move that earlier, and part of that.
Out of interest, moving it earlier, obviously I can understand from a patient's perspective.
Yeah.
That makes total sense. Like I get it from like a patient experience, which is obviously a key indicator.
Yeah.
What other, are there other reasons more, I guess, you know, from a sort of efficiency basis or an outcomes basis, or, you know, what other kind of, I guess, harder metrics are there? Because I'm sure there are reasons for moving that earlier.
Yeah, so some of that is to do with, you know, day of surgery cancellations and delays. So there's a decent percentage of those cancellations and delays that happen because of consent stuff. So that might be
Okay.
a patient is, you know, in a small minority, it might be that a patient has changed their mind based on some information. It doesn't often happen because there's that kind of assumption that you're kind of too far down the road.
Yeah, you're at the top of the bungee jump with the thing on your legs.
Exactly.
You're going to jump off the thing.
Yeah. But then, you know, often it's things like, you know, they can't find the consent form, or just that logistic thing of, you know, I've tried to have 8 conversations in that tight 30 minutes and a couple of them have gone on. So we've kind of delayed. And so some of that is in terms of, you know, removing those quite expensive delays. You know, theatre time is actually really expensive. There's, you know, 20 people involved. There's, you know, there's lots of bodies there. And that's, you know, especially where you're being, you know, paid for activity, that's a really, you know, expensive delay. And so lots of it is that. Obviously we've talked about the impact if you're changing the kind of that shared decision making element around removing some of those unnecessary operations, people deciding to have, you know, more conservative treatments appropriately. But also, as you say, there are other often more difficult things to measure. So if you have had good information, good kind of things about what to expect, how to prepare for surgery. So there's, you know, we're not a kind of prehab platform, but there is some that kind of prehabilitation information that sits within platform. So that kind of supports the stuff in terms of, you know, why stopping smoking during the build-up and those kind of stuff, which have an impact on outcomes. But also we see, and there's some work at the moment to kind of understand how much of an impact this is. But anecdotally, at least, we have a number of people who say, you know, actually I would have gone to A&E because of, you know, this swelling or, you know, whatever it is. But actually I was able to go back into my concentric information, you know, a week after the operation and got the context of actually,
that's great.
That swelling is kind of normal. We expect it to sit there for, you know, 2 weeks and then it'll start to settle. So kind of don't worry about it. And equally, you know, things that say, actually, you know, if you have this and this after the operation, actually, we really want to take that seriously. And so there is, you know, some of that stuff in terms of outcomes and you know, self-management where appropriate. But also, you know, just in terms of the processes, I had, you know, there's been a couple of examples, and particularly as, you know, as a surgical reg. And so when a surgical reg comes to me and said, and, you know, there's a couple of emails I've had in the last few months saying, you know, you use Concentric for the first time today. God, it was so nice to turn up to the surgical briefing with a coffee in hand instead of, you know, running there sweating, having missed the first minute of it. Never happened before. So,
and that's because everyone at that hospital, I guess, or in that ward or wherever that was, had already provided their consent through Concentric prior to them getting to hospital.
Yeah, so they'd had that information before. They'd been kind of supported by conversations before. You know, that morning of surgery was more just a, you know, anything changed, everything happy, you know, any particular questions, rather than this kind of race to tell you as much as I can.
I mean, if you sat with a piece of paper and you were like, when would we like to get patients? When would we like to explain to patients about surgery? When would we like to get them to agree to it?
Would it be when they've got their bottom out? Probably not.
Yeah, it would probably not be like, oh, you know, 10 minutes to them getting wheeled into the thing. Exactly. So you guys are on a tear. I mean, you guys are also Concentric. You're working with a number of trusts across the UK. So what is it? I know it'll be a range of different things, but if you've got, there's an element to Concentric, which is around the digitization of the consent, which is a process efficiency thing, which makes total sense. But then you've got this sort of explanation, you know, bringing with someone, facilitating the conversation, as well as the sort of aftercare. So across the different people that you're working with, without wishing to give away anything confidential, because that's not the point, but where are you seeing the most interest in those slightly different elements to the platform?
Yeah, so I mean, I think so clearly, COVID and the recovery and all the focus that is at the moment around, digital first elective pathways to say, we have a big challenge around backlog. Everyone is trying to, see how they can get to, 110%, 120%, business as usual activity.
Wow.
And so those little, if you can do 10 cataracts on a list instead of 9 because of a little tweak here and a little tweak there, actually that makes a real difference. So the most obvious example of a kind of driving force in terms of the market was the kind of NHSX funding that it's a couple of tranches over the last few months, basically to say perioperative pathways, there's funding available for things that enable that to be digital first, keeping patients out of hospital, only bringing them into hospital when they're when it's absolutely required, but importantly not losing that quality of care. If you think about the consent process, God, it's so easy just to say, well, just send some information to the patient, get them to sign it, done. No need for that appointment at all. But actually, that completely loses, the value here is in the conversation between clinician and patient, because, as we said, these are complicated, decisions and spheres, and it's not about saying, well, we're just going to send you some information and get you to sign it. That completely misses the point. But it's saying, when can we use the clinician's brain to do what only they can do? When do we use facilities in hospital when only need to? So a patient is only in hospital or in outpatients when they absolutely need to be, not for everything that they just need to have a conversation. You and I are not in the same room doing this because we don't need to be.
No, and I think that's a great point. I mean, clinicians should be doing what they're best at doing, which I would argue is not running around like a headless chicken every morning trying to get people to sign bits of paper. And so I also think from a patient's perspective, and from a systems perspective, if you're saying, on average 20% of operations may not need to happen because if those people if those patients had been educated, discussed with in more detail about non-surgical options, and you said for some conditions it's significantly higher, that's a huge amount of cost in the system, which if you can facilitate the removal of that digitally, which it sounds like that's what Concentric or part of what you guys are delivering, that has the potential, you're not just talking about small tweaks to the consent process. That's a huge impact on the clinical care budget for any trust potentially.
Would I be doing this as a kind of founder of Concentric if I thought this was just about digitizing a form? No, I'd be doing something different.
Right.
So for me, the opportunity here is that actually, even as of when we went live with the kind of first iteration of Concentric and at Imperial in March 2020, that was solving a problem for both patients and clinicians. But there's the opportunity in terms of so we've touched about some of the stuff around shared decision making, but also the opportunity to make that so much more personalized to patients. So there's all the stuff, all the work around personalization of medicine and outcomes and all that kind of stuff. And for us, there's a real opportunity to say, us and others will do lots of work in terms of collecting outcomes for patients and kind of understanding that. But for us, then we can bring that right back into like an actual process between clinicians and patients, not for some, organizational dashboard somewhere over there in terms of their outcomes, but saying, bring that right back to this conversation to say, for you and for someone who has, the things that mean a lot to you, here's what people say. Here's what, would patients like you make the same decision again? If you think about the kind of, reviewing something in Amazon, you can, or TripAdvisor, you can say, well, what do couples say about this hotel? And so bringing some of that thought process into saying, actually I can engage with this decision. I can see, I can visualize it in my own, for me, in my own eyes, as it were. And And there's just so much value in that, instead of saying, well, everyone who's going to have a total hip replacement is going to have the same outcomes. Just not true, right?
And I think your point around, in every other aspect of everyone's life, you've got, I mean, if not infinite choice, a huge amount of choice, and that's what people are becoming accustomed to. So there isn't just one answer to anything. And I suspect, or I know as a patient myself, and I suspect many others feel the same way, is that if you interact with a healthcare professional and they tell you that you should do this, and they don't give you any other information, or they don't, it can be very frustrating and concerning. And so having anything that helps with that kind of education process, because I think it speaks to trust as well, because the more someone tells you that this is the way you have to do it, I think the more pushback you're going to get and lose some trust in the system, and people might just opt out altogether, which may create a much larger downstream problem, if they don't have that thing treated right now.
And from that trust perspective, again, so much of this comes back down to conversation, between two people. So if a clinician is in a situation where they need to have a transactional thing signed because of different pressures, or because of needing to just tell a load of information in 5 minutes, then you can see how that trust degrades between patient and that individual clinician, but also the wider profession, right? But if you go into that and say, okay, I've kind of been supported by some information before, I'm in a non-time pressured environment, and I know I can go back and kind of look at this information again in my own time and share that with others. But for this 10 minutes, I'm going to have a conversation with you as a person.
I think it's game changing. I mean, I really, really do. This is why, like I said at the head of the show, really elegant solution to a problem that many people may not have even realized the scale of the problem, why it was so important. But that is massively important, and also has a huge possibility to impact the entire healthcare system.
I hope so.
Good. Well, and how close, I always like to ask this, how close is Concentric now to the original sort of aid memoir type app thing that you were like hacking together back in the day? I mean, how true is it to that sort of original vision, and what's what I guess if what's different, if anything?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So as founders, three founders of Concentric, myself, Martin, who's my brother, and Ed St John, who is a consultant oncoplastic breast surgeon down in now in Portsmouth. And so it's one of those ones where I'd kind of started something back in 2013, and Ed had actually started something slightly in parallel, slightly more kind of, more like a kind of, an e-form in its simple case, but that was being used by some clinicians in London and around. And then we kind of became aware of each other in, 2015 or so. Tony Young, so we were both clinical entrepreneurs on the clinical entrepreneur program. And, Tony said, well, guys, you stop being daft, to come together on this. And Ed and I spent 8 months deciding whether we were friends or foes, until saying, well, actually, why don't we actually try and actually do something with this, rather than both have tiny little pet projects.
50% of something bigger is much better than 100% of something very, very, very small.
And so we kind of, I think we, brought some of that stuff together, and I've probably, pushed more the, that kind of shared decision making piece, and Ed as still a practicing clinician and is very, very close to that kind of process on the ground, has made sure that we've kept good sight of the, the logistics and the kind of reality of like, how does this really work? Like, how do we really tackle the kind of complex world of medicine and the system to make something that isn't just looks nice in a demo, but frankly just doesn't work in the real world. And
it's just not.
I think we've kind of brought those two things together. I mean, in reality, and it's one of the things that we kind of every quarter we kind of think, well, is it the thing that we're going to do now? Actually, that aid memoir isn't a live product. It's not one that's currently someone could use. But it probably will be at some point.
Good, cool.
But, so. That's
good to know. So what's next for you guys? What's up in the next 12, 18 months?
Yeah, so so the next 18 months for us is, getting from, so we're still really early in this journey, right? So we launched with our first kind of product into clinical practice, and those who are kind of accustomed to business speak, that's a kind of MVP, a minimum viable product. But healthcare MVPs are, especially if it's something that's used in a hospital, is slightly different to the kind of consumer MVP. There's a lot of committees and things you need to get through to get to that kind of day one MVP. But over the last 18 months, massively accelerated, because of COVID and those kind of stuff. But we've got to the point where we now have quite a few NHS trusts. Most of our activity is still in the UK. Most of that is still is the NHS is the public sector. We have a number of kind of private clinics and stuff as well, but it's mainly UK and public and public sector. But it's scaling out from those. So whereas 2 years ago, digital consent just wasn't a product category. No one was kind of thinking about it, or even if they were thinking about it, couldn't have gone out and bought something. There just wasn't.
No, there wasn't anything there.
And now that so we're in a kind of small group of three or four products who are used somewhere. We're the kind of market leaders in that space, but there are others, and so it's scaling. It's we've gone from 0 to 1. Now it's about going from 1 to 100, but also understanding how we do that. So how we scale that stuff. How what are all those little manual processes that we haven't had time to get rid of them, and they increasingly become annoying as you try and scale. So what are the processes that we need to put in place to allow us to go 1 to 100 instead of 1 to 2 over the next 12 months?
Good. Well, look, we're coming up to the end of the show. It's been super interesting. I haven't been doing this before, so you're my first person to ask this to, but I want to kind of end the shows going forward around what kind of can you give us some behaviors or lessons that you've taken from your journey from clinician onto entrepreneur in a startup? Doesn't have to be many, just 1 or 2 key things that you kind of hold true to, or you believe have led you to this place.
Yeah. So not thought about it, but so I think one of the things for me is that I don't think, and I don't think I ever will be the kind of classic CEO entrepreneur in how I envisage the kind of Elon Musk shouting from the rooftops, crazy extrovert type of thing. I'm a clinician at heart, and I've needed over the last 6 years or so to understand, obviously, and there's lots of steep learning curves in terms of the business stuff. And if you think of the kind of spectrum from classic clinician to classic businessman, clearly moving a little way along that spectrum, but being really comfortable in saying, actually, I'm a clinician at heart. There was a challenge that I, as a clinician, and there's lots of others of us in this kind of clinical entrepreneur space by now, there was a problem that I or a small group of us wanted to solve, and we saw an opportunity to do that. And it just happened to be that it was easier, more likely to be successful to do that, outside of the system, on the kind of business bit of the spectrum, rather than within the trust, or within the NHS. So it's it's just being comfortable with that and saying, I don't need to be a traditional CEO. I can be a clinician who understands some of that business, and it's somewhere along that spectrum. And to be honest, clinicians listen to clinicians. It speaks volumes, and it just gives that confidence that you go into a demo and you speak there as a surgeon, and they know that, or at least that it gives them that initial reassurance that what you're going to talk to them is not going to be something that's completely irrelevant to them.
Yeah, exactly. It's already been, I think that I completely agree. It's like, be true to yourself, be true to your mission, but also understand that, you need to be as authentic as possible, and if you're as authentic as possible, then, people can either take you or leave you, but more often than not, they'll take you.
Yeah.
Cool. Daf, thank you so much for coming on the show. Dafydd Loughran, CEO and founder of Concentric Health. What's the website? Where do people go if they're interested?
So just go to concentric.health. If you search for digital consent, we'll be there.
All right, good. Daf, thanks for coming on the show, and thank you to everyone for listening. We'll be back with another great guest next week.